All right, now we are into the layering section. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how I layered a bunch of synths up and built the song out so that it would be able to stay interesting throughout its entire duration. So I've already showed you all the layering of the drums. To jog your memory, that's these right here. So then on top of that, we've got a couple of bass layers right here. So this one right here is a built-in serum patch, actually. Little bit EQ. And this is a nice short punchy bass with that little bit of sustain on there. And is being ducked by LFO Tool. For those of you unfamiliar with this concept, it's also known as side chaining, which is a slightly different method of getting the same effect. But I'm going to go over ducking because that's what I typically use because it gives me a little more control. Essentially, what ducking is it's bringing a signal's volume down to get out of the way of something else. So in this case, we've got this kick here, and this kick is nice and bassy, as we've established. But this bass also has a good amount of low end to it. And it mostly stays out of the way of the kick, but still, I want to make sure they stay completely out of each other's way. So I use this to accomplish that. It ramps it up when the kick is going, and then lets it ring out when the kick's not going. This is LFO Tool by X4 Records. It goes for, I think, $50. And there are other ways to do this as well. Sidechain compression is another one. If you look up how to do it in Logic or whatever your DAW is, it's pretty easy. And another plugin I know people use is Kickstart. But I like LFO Tool because not only does it give me a lot of control in how I duck stuff and how that sounds, I can kind of tweak this as I want. But it also allows me to do other stuff to shape sound, which I showed you in the drums video. And I'll even set this different places depending on how long my kick is, so I could do it here for a less extreme effect. But my kick is a little longer, so I chose to go here instead. So you get that pumping feel. Layered with that bass is another bass, and this one is a sample from Cuckoo's C Mix pack. He did a bunch of analog synthesis and then exported a bunch of these samples, and so I'm using a couple samples from that pack, actually. I'll get to the other one in a second. Got some pumping and some EQ on that. Muffled it a bit. What this is doing is providing a bit of a distorted feel to this very clean bass, because this bass right here is very clean, and I wanted to dirty it up a bit, add a bit of grit, add a bit of distortion. And also increase the bass's amount of mid-range, not only so it would fill out the sound a bit more, but also so it would be more audible on smaller speakers that have trouble producing some of the lower frequencies. Allows it to cut through a bit more. So let's add in all the drums to see how we're doing. Hear the difference that makes. So beyond that, now we've got 2 Pluck layers. You've heard this one before. This is the other sample from Cuckoo's C Mix pack, and I believe this was actually originally intended to be a bass, but it ended up working really nicely as a Pluck. So I've got some EQ on that. That's got a lot of lower mids, and lower mids are good in small quantities. They add warmth, they add fullness, but too much and your track sort of falls apart. You want everything to be very clear. So also reducing the amount of high end a bit. That is also being pumped by LFO Tool. Basically the same as the bass. And on top of that, there's this other Pluck. So this is Nexus. I believe this was originally an ARP preset. This is from their Trance Leads pack. And I took off the arpeggiator so I could just use it as a Pluck. Take off the EQ and the LFO Tool. There was a little too much low in there, so I just got rid of that. A little bit of the lower mids, a little dip there. Subtle, but it clears up some headroom. So this guy's supplying the mids. And And this guy's providing that kind of clean sound. And in this case, all of the notes are extended to end right where the next one begins, and this is accomplished in Logic by doing force legato. I think I did trim note end to following notes. Yeah, so you've essentially got this wall of sound at all times, but each one stops just in time to let the next one come in, so nothing really overlaps. And real quick, I want to go over a very simple Pluck design that I didn't actually use, but I think it's good to know because not everyone has access to Nexus, and Nexus is admittedly grossly overpriced. So let's open a Serum here because that's a good training tool. And let me go ahead and copy this MIDI over. So here we go. And that sounds like absolute garbage, so let's bring this up an octave. Still sounds like garbage, so let's crank the unison. I apologize for the loudness. So I got ourselves a pretty basic super saw. It's got that choral effect. I can show you what that looks like visually. And so the big key to getting that Pluck sound is the filter. If you go like that, you get future bass. But if you go the other way, you get a Pluck. So I'm going to use this to essentially move this very fast. And I want this to trigger every time a note's triggered. So this is a high cut filter, also known as a low pass filter. And depending on how steep I make this, you get a very different effect. And then depending on how you move the cutoff, you can also affect the sound. So over here, it's very laid back. Anyway, and that will become important later in arrangement to keep the energy level rising and keep everything interesting. And I'll go ahead and make this preset available in the sample pack so you can play around with it. But back to the Plucks that we're actually using. Very similar. So let's go ahead and build that up with what I've got so far. And that's the basis of your track right there. So from there, I can go ahead and add in the melody. So we got two elements playing the melody here. And I'll go into both of these in turn. Both of these are being pumped, although not as extremely, because the melody is meant to sit on top of everything else. And also it's got multiple notes that hit while the kick hits, and I don't want those to get drowned out. So I have this ducked, but not quite as extremely. This doesn't go all the way down. And as you can hear, this has got a good amount of delay and reverb on it. This is another Nexus patch that I've EQ'd pretty extremely. All of that low end was just completely unnecessary. It fought with everything else and created a bunch of mud. So I just got rid of it, and then to really bring out that clarity, boosted a decent amount of high end. And by itself, it almost sounds a little too much, a little too sharp, but in context with the mix, cuts through nicely. Then layered with that is this lead. Also being pumped less extremely than everything else. EQ'd a bit. Too many mids, too much low end. And as you can hear, that has a lot of delay and reverb on it. Like to give you an idea, if I get rid of the delay, add it back in. If I get rid of it all, And the reverb not only makes it kind of sound cool and adds this vibiness, but it also lets you fill in these spaces where the melody isn't playing. That way the sound of the leads is always somewhere in there, even if only a little bit as it's dying down in between these sections. So in that case, here's what we've got so far. And we're getting there, but this is lacking a bit of atmosphere. So to fix that, now we've got some pads. And that is two separate pads. First of all, this guy here. Another Nexus preset, got some reverb on it. As you can hear, it had way too much low end, and also the upper mids were a little harsh, so I dipped those down a little bit. And this is another case of something being pumped a bit less. This is meant to fill out the track, so we want to make sure there's a bit of it audible at all times. And also, typically for me, I like my pads to hit pretty quickly. I know sometimes people have a pretty long attack. In my case, I like it to hit pretty quickly, but this does kind of take a bit of time to ramp up. Which is nice. It's not like the static sound. It creates some movement, keeps it interesting, and creates some atmosphere. And then layered with that is another pad. This one is pretty static. And once again, this has a very quick attack and a very quick release, so you only hear it when I want you to. And I did quite a bit to that, so let me take off all the processing. This will be probably a little loud. You can hear it's a super saw with a lot of detune. Some EQ. Get rid of that low end, a bunch of high end, muffle it a bit, bring it to the background. We want these pads to take the background and always be audible, but also be subtle. Too much high end, then they sound too up front, and we don't want that. Which is also accomplished by the reverb. So essentially what this one does is this fills in some high end and some upper mids that this one was lacking, and so together they sound like that. And on top of that, I have Ozone Imager, and so without it, you can hear the effect that had on the wideness. And I know Logic also has a built-in plugin for increasing wideness, but I just got this, so I was playing around with it. Essentially what this does is it leverages the Haas effect, which is where you duplicate two signals, detune them a little bit from each other, and then pan them. It sounds wide, so if that's used subtly, it can sound really nice. So that means not only are we layering vertically in terms of we're filling up the frequency spectrum and we're filling up instrument parts, we're also layering horizontally left and right. So the drums are pretty much straight up the middle. And some people will pan their hi-hats around, which is cool, but I didn't do that in this case. So the drums are basically straight up the middle, as is the bass. Bass and drums straight up the middle. The plucks, since they're made from super saws, they do have some width to them. So if your drums are here, your plucks are here, and then your pads are like way out here. Once again, they're here to provide atmosphere, and so it makes sense that they be the widest elements in the mix. So they just kind of bring the track to life. Like, let me go ahead and mute these, and then I'll unmute them. And in the end, I have them mixed decently low in the mix. They're decently subtle, but they just fill out the track, bring this atmosphere, but without muddying anything up, which is why they have a bunch of low end taken out. And then there's an EQ right here that is affecting them both, and I will get to that in the arrangement video. And then finally, we have some white noise, both a riser and a downward whoosh. I'll include both of these in the sample pack. That's pumped a little bit and then has a little bit of this taken out. And then this riser here. And these are both transitional elements that I knew I'd need, so I put them in the loop. White noise is a very powerful ally, especially in a genre like this where it's very accepted and very normal to use a lot of white noise. You can very easily use it to either build energy or kind of herald the start of a new section. So, all together. You hear that white noise in the background doing its thing. So that's the main section. This is what, when I made this, I knew I was building towards. And that's a thing I want to cover right now is layer with arrangement in mind, especially with genres like this where you're dealing with a lot of the same elements that you're hearing for most of the song that are slowly building their way to a climax. You want to make sure that you have enough elements to where once you put them all together, it sounds huge, but also good enough elements to where if you take a bunch away, it still sounds fine. So for instance, I can take away these pads and take away the lead and get rid of some of these drums. And that's a completely workable section. It's at a nice energy level. It sounds nice. It sounds full. But I can build up the energy. Instant boost in energy. And then if I bring in the leads, that takes up the energy and the emotion up by several notches. So make sure that you layer with the arrangement in mind because that will make your life much easier going forward. And also to that end, I added an arpeggio that is not meant to play while the lead's playing, but is meant to play in the absence of the lead because I knew I wanted a section where you've got the chords building up, then the arp comes in, then the lead is introduced, and then you build using the lead and kind of ditch the arpeggio. So let me get rid of these and bring in the arp instead. These are both Nexus presets using one of Nexus's built-in arpeggio settings that I tweaked to give it a lot more swing to match with everything else. So let me get rid of everything. Once again, wanted to sit better in the mix, so I got some EQ. And LFO tool, of course. And then layered with that is the same pattern, but on a different patch. And whereas the first one was very short, very plucky, this one's kind of long. It's got some sustain. So they complement each other nicely. One gives that attack, one gives that sustain, that long sound to kind of fill everything out, add more atmosphere once again. And also fill in some of that mid-range. So then together with the rest of the mix. So now with the addition of the ARP, that means that I have basically two sections to work with. One section that relies on the ARP to kind of provide that melodic element to keep things interesting, and then the other that relies on that main melody, the part that's meant to get stuck in your head. So now I've got pretty much everything I need, barring a couple little extra add-ons that I'll get into when I get into arrangement, but I've got pretty much everything I need to start arranging. So with that, I will see you guys in the next video on arrangement.